When we hear the name Henry VIII, we think of one man and 6 women whose fates became the very definition of power, faith, and survival. But who were they really? Not just names in a rhyme, but human beings born into privilege, ambition, and danger. Katherine of Aragon, the loyal queen who defied an empire, Anne Boleyn, the reformer who lost her crown and her head. Jane Seymour, who gave Henry his son at the cost of her life. Anne of Cleves, who turned rejection into freedom. Katherine Howard, youth destroyed by politics. And Catherine Parr, the survivor who outlived them all. Each left a mark on England's story and on the dynasty that changed the world. This is the story of 6 queens, 6 lives, and the transformation of a kingdom. From the Spanish princess who refused to yield to the scholar who shaped the future of England, these women navigated a world where marriage meant politics, pregnancy meant power, and survival required wit, courage, and sometimes surrender. Their stories span nearly 4 decades from 1509 to 1547. Through their eyes, we witness the birth of the English Reformation, the dissolution of monasteries, the rise of Parliament, and the creation of a new kind of monarchy. Their children would rule England for the next century, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and Edward VI, each carrying forward the legacy of their mother's triumphs and tragedies. But beyond the crown jewels and court ceremonies, beyond the political maneuvering and religious upheaval, these were women who loved, hoped, feared, and endured. They faced the universal challenges of marriage and motherhood within the extraordinary crucible of Tudor England, where a king's favor could elevate a family to greatness, and his displeasure could mean death. Today, we tell their complete stories, not the simplified tales of rhymes and popular memory, but the full arc of 6 remarkable lives, their births, their educations, their marriages, their children, their triumphs, their falls, and their lasting legacies. Each chapter unfolds as a complete biography, revealing not just what happened to Henry VIII's wives, but who they truly were. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of Versailles, 4 royal children were born into a world of silk, crowns, and ceremony. Only to see it all collapse in blood and revolution. They were heirs to an empire, yet destined for prisons, graves, and exile. This isn't the story of Marie Antoinette, it's the story of the innocent lives caught in her shadow, the children who lived and died as the monarchy burned. This is whatever happened to Marie Antoinette's children. On December 16, 1485, in the Archbishop's palace at Alcalá de Henares, near Madrid, a daughter was born to the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Her parents, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, had united Spain through their marriage and were completing the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. They named their daughter Catherine, Catalina in Spanish, and from her first breath, she was destined for greatness. Catherine's childhood was unlike any other royal princess of her time. Her mother, Queen Isabella, believed passionately in education, especially for women. While most noble daughters learned needlework and dancing, Catherine studied Latin, philosophy, theology, and canon law under the humanist scholar Alessandro Geraldini. She could speak fluent Latin, Spanish, French, and would later master English. She learned to debate theology with university scholars and could discuss Aristotle as easily as she could embroider silk. By age 3, Catherine was already promised in marriage. The target was Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Henry VII of England. This union would cement the alliance between Spain and England against their mutual enemy, France. For 15 years, negotiations continued while Catherine prepared for her destiny as Queen of England. In 1501, at age 15, Catherine sailed from Spain to marry a young man she had never met. The journey took months, delayed by storms and political negotiations. When she finally arrived in England, she was greeted with pageantry and celebration. Arthur was 16, pale and scholarly, a stark contrast to his robust younger brother Henry. On November 14, 1501, in St. Paul's Cathedral, Katherine of Aragon became Catherine, Princess of Wales. The young couple was sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where Arthur was learning to govern Wales. But their marriage would be tragically brief. On April 2, 1502, just 5 months after their wedding, Prince Arthur died, possibly of the sweating sickness that periodically swept through England. Catherine, at 17, found herself a widow in a foreign land. What happened next would haunt the rest of her life. Had her marriage to Arthur been consummated? Catherine always maintained it had not, that she remained a virgin. This distinction would prove crucial, for it would determine whether she could marry Arthur's younger brother Henry, now heir to the throne. Canon law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow if the first marriage had been consummated, but allowed it if the marriage had remained unconsummated. For 7 years, Catherine lived in limbo. Henry VII kept her in England as a potential bride for his remaining son, but provided her with little money and no clear status. She struggled to maintain her household, pawning her jewelry to pay her servants. These were years of uncertainty and hardship that taught her resilience and self-reliance. Everything changed in 1509 when Henry VII died, and his 18-year-old son ascended the throne as Henry VIII. Young, athletic, and bursting with energy, Henry was also deeply attracted to Catherine, now 23 and at the height of her beauty. Within weeks of his coronation, Henry married Catherine in a private ceremony. On June 11, 1509, they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony of unprecedented splendor. The early years of their marriage seemed blessed. Henry adored his wife, calling her "my most beloved consort." Catherine was intelligent, pious, and dignified, everything a queen should be. She was also fertile. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage in 1510, but on January 1, 1511, she gave birth to a son, Henry. The kingdom rejoiced, but the prince died after only 52 days, devastating both parents. Catherine would endure 6 pregnancies in total. After Prince Henry came a miscarriage in 1513, then another short-lived son in 1514 who died within hours of birth. In 1516, she finally delivered a healthy child, a daughter they named Mary. 2 more pregnancies followed, a stillborn daughter in 1518 and a final miscarriage in 1519. By then, Catherine was 34, and it became clear there would be no more children. During these years of personal trial, Catherine proved herself as more than just a wife and mother. In 1513, when Henry invaded France, he left Catherine as regent of England. She governed the kingdom with skill and authority, and when the Scots invaded the north, she organized the defense that culminated in the devastating English victory at Flodden Field, where King James IV of Scotland was killed. Catherine sent Henry, the Scottish king's bloodied coat, as a trophy of her regency. But by the 1520s, Henry's attention had turned to a younger woman, Anne Boleyn. The king became convinced that his lack of male heirs was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. He began seeking an annulment from Pope Clement VII, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the beginning. This became known as the King's Great Matter. Catherine fought the annulment with every weapon at her disposal. She marshaled canon lawyers, appealed to her nephew Emperor Charles V, and appeared personally before the Legatine court in 1529. In one of history's most dramatic moments, she knelt before Henry and pleaded, "I beseech you, and spare me the extremity of this new court. I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever comfortable to your will and pleasure." But Henry was determined. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry broke with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. In 1533, he secretly married the pregnant Anne Boleyn and had his marriage to Catherine declared null and void by his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Catherine never accepted the annulment. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen or to accept the title of Dowager Princess of Wales, Arthur's widow. She maintained until her death that she was Henry's only true wife and England's only true queen. This defiance came at enormous cost. Henry separated her from their daughter Mary and banished her to increasingly remote and uncomfortable residences. Her final home was Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire, a damp, unhealthy place where she lived in virtual imprisonment. Her household was reduced to a handful of loyal Spanish servants. She spent her days in prayer, embroidery, and writing letters defending her position. Her health declined steadily in the harsh conditions. On January 7, 1536, Katherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton. She was 50 years old. Her last letter was to Henry. "Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things." She signed it, as always, Catherine the Queen. Henry ordered that she be buried as Dowager Princess of Wales, but the common people remembered her as their true queen. They lined the roads as her funeral cortege passed, calling out, "God save Queen Catherine." Her tomb at Peterborough Cathedral still bears fresh pomegranates, the symbol of Granada and her Spanish heritage, left by admirers nearly 5 centuries later. Catherine's legacy was her unwavering conscience and her daughter Mary, who would become England's first reigning queen. She embodied the medieval ideals of queenship, piety, loyalty, and dignity and suffering. Her refusal to accept Henry's annulment helped precipitate the English Reformation, making her both its first victim and an unwitting architect of religious revolution. But perhaps her greatest legacy was proving that a woman could stand firm against the most powerful king in Europe and maintain her principles even unto death. In an age when women were expected to be silent and obedient, Katherine of Aragon spoke truth to power and never surrendered her crown, even when it cost her everything. The next queen would bring a very different spirit to the throne, one of reform, ambition, and ultimately tragedy that would end at the executioner's block. The exact year of Anne Boleyn's birth remains a mystery, lost somewhere between 1501 and 1507, but her impact on English history would be anything but uncertain. Born into the ambitious Boleyn family at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, Anne was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a successful diplomat and courtier, and Elizabeth Howard, member of one of England's most powerful, noble families. From birth, she was destined for the court, though no one could have predicted she would reshape the very foundations of English monarchy and religion. Unlike most English noblewomen, Anne received an extraordinary education abroad. At age 12, she was sent to the Netherlands court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands and aunt to the future Emperor Charles V. There she learned French, politics, and the sophisticated manners of European court life. But her real education came when she was transferred to the French court around 1514, serving as a maid of honor to Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. France in the early 16th century, was the pinnacle of Renaissance culture. The court was a whirlwind of art, literature, fashion, and intellectual discourse. Anne spent nearly 7 years there, absorbing not just the language and customs, but the religious ideas that were beginning to challenge Catholic orthodoxy. She encountered the works of reformist thinkers and developed the religious convictions that would later influence England's break with Rome. When Anne returned to England around 1522, she was no longer the provincial English girl who had left. She was sophisticated, multilingual, and possessed of a magnetic charm that immediately distinguished her at Henry VIII's court. She was not conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards. She was dark-haired and olive-skinned in an age that prized fair complexions, but she had an indefinable allure that captivated everyone, especially men. Anne initially served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, but soon caught the attention of the king himself. Henry, then in his 30s and married for over a decade, became increasingly obsessed with the young woman who seemed to embody everything exotic and sophisticated about continental court culture. Unlike his previous mistresses, Anne refused to become merely another royal paramour. She demanded marriage or nothing. Their courtship lasted nearly 7 years, a period of increasing political and religious turmoil. Henry's letters to Anne, which survive today, reveal a man desperately in love, begging for her affection and promising her the crown. Anne skillfully managed the relationship, maintaining her distance while encouraging his pursuit. She understood that her power lay in being unattainable, and she used that power to reshape England. By 1532, Anne was pregnant, and Henry could wait no longer. In a secret ceremony held sometime in January 1533, possibly at Dover or Greenwich, Anne Boleyn became Henry's wife, while Katherine of Aragon still held the title of Queen. The marriage was kept secret until May, when Thomas Cranmer, Henry's new Archbishop of Canterbury, formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and his marriage to Anne valid. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She was already 6 months pregnant, and the kingdom held its breath, hoping for a male heir. The coronation was a lavish affair, but the London crowds who lined the streets were notably lukewarm. Many still considered Catherine the true queen and saw Anne as a usurper. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter at Greenwich Palace. The child was named Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers. While Henry was disappointed not to have a son, he was confident that sons would follow. Elizabeth's birth was celebrated with appropriate ceremony, though the planned tournaments were quietly cancelled. Few could have predicted that this baby girl would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's position as queen was complicated by the religious and political upheaval her marriage had caused. Henry had broken with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolved monasteries to fund his royal treasury. Anne was not merely a passive beneficiary of these changes. She actively promoted religious reform. She protected reformist preachers, promoted the translation of the Bible into English, and used her influence to advance men who shared her religious convictions. But Anne's queenship was marked by tragedy as well as triumph. She suffered a miscarriage in the summer of 1534, likely a male child. This was devastating news for a woman whose primary role was to produce male heirs. A second pregnancy ended in another miscarriage in 1535. The pressure was mounting. January 29, 1536, brought both personal and political catastrophe. On the day Katherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle, Anne suffered another miscarriage. Worse, this fetus was reportedly male and appeared to be about 4 months developed. The loss of what would have been Henry's longed-for son was a blow from which Anne never recovered. Henry's passion for Anne had been cooling for months. He had already begun pursuing Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The miscarriage of a son gave Henry the excuse he needed to rid himself of a wife who had failed in her primary duty. Moreover, Anne's strong personality and political involvement had begun to chafe. Henry wanted a submissive wife, not a partner in governance. The end came swiftly and brutally. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were devastating: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and treasonous conspiracy against the king's life. The evidence was thin to non-existent, based largely on court gossip and the testimony of musicians and courtiers under interrogation. The men accused with Anne were tried first. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, confessed under torture to adultery with the Queen. Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn all maintained their innocence, but were condemned nonetheless. All 5 men were executed on May 17, 1536. Anne's own trial took place on May 15th in the Great Hall of the Tower. She was tried by a jury of her peers, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided as judge. Anne conducted herself with dignity and eloquence, denying all charges and maintaining her innocence. But the verdict was predetermined. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, at approximately 8 a.m., Anne Boleyn was led to a scaffold erected on Tower Green. A skilled French swordsman had been brought from Calais to perform the execution, a final mercy from Henry, as beheading by sword was considered more honorable and less painful than the traditional axe. Anne's last words were, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She knelt upright without a block, and the swordsman struck off her head with a single blow. Anne Boleyn was dead at approximately 30 years of age, having been queen for just under 3 years. Her body was hastily buried in an arrow chest in the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Anne's legacy is complex and enduring. She was the mother of Elizabeth I, who would rule England for 45 years and oversee the nation's golden age. Her promotion of religious reform helped establish Protestantism in England. Her intelligence and political acumen showed that women could be partners in governance, not merely decorative appendages. But Anne also represented the dangers of Tudor court life, where royal favor could elevate a family to greatness, and royal displeasure could destroy them utterly. Her story became a cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the fickleness of kings. In death, Anne Boleyn became a symbol of different things to different people, a martyr for religious reform, or a victim of judicial murder, an example of overweening ambition, or a woman destroyed by a political system that gave her power but no security. Her influence would outlive her by centuries, transmitted through her daughter Elizabeth, who inherited her mother's intelligence, determination, and political skill. The next queen would bring a very different approach to queenship, one of quiet submission that would finally give Henry what he most desired. In the rolling hills of Wiltshire, around 1508, Jane Seymour was born into a family that perfectly embodied the emerging Tudor gentry. The Seymours of Wolf Hall were ambitious but not overly prominent, wealthy but not titled, connected to court but not deeply embedded in its dangerous factional politics. Jane was the eldest daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, and unlike the cosmopolitan education of her predecessors, her upbringing was thoroughly English and thoroughly conventional. Jane's childhood was spent learning the traditional accomplishments of a gentlewoman: needlework, household management, basic literacy, and the quiet virtues of modesty and obedience. She was not educated in classical languages or theology like Katherine of Aragon, nor did she absorb the sophisticated court culture of France like Anne Boleyn. Instead, she learned to be exactly what Henry VIII would come to desire most: a submissive, fertile wife who would give him sons without challenging his authority. The Seymour family's fortunes began to rise during the 1520s as Jane's brothers carved out successful court careers. Edward Seymour became a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, while Thomas Seymour served as a gentleman pensioner. It was through these family connections that Jane came to court, first serving as a lady-in-waiting to Katherine of Aragon and later continuing in the same role under Anne Boleyn. Jane was serving Anne Boleyn when the king's attention first turned to her, probably in early 1536. Contemporary descriptions paint her as fair-haired and pale-skinned, conforming to Tudor ideals of beauty, but with unremarkable features. What attracted Henry was not her beauty, but her demeanor. She was everything Anne Boleyn was not. Where Anne was dark and dramatic, Jane was fair and calm. Where Anne was assertive and political, Jane was submissive and domestic. Where Anne challenged Henry, Jane deferred to him. The Seymour family, recognizing their opportunity, carefully orchestrated Jane's rise. When Henry began showing interest in their daughter, they housed her in apartments belonging to Edward Seymour and his wife, ensuring she was always properly chaperoned while remaining accessible to royal visits. Jane was coached to refuse Henry's gifts and advances unless he offered marriage, following the same strategy Anne Boleyn had used so successfully. By April 1536, as Anne Boleyn faced the charges that would lead to her execution, Henry was already planning his third marriage. The day after Anne's execution, May 20, 1536, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. On May 30th, 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's death, they were married in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. There was no grand coronation. Henry had learned to be more cautious about public celebrations. Jane's queenship was deliberately designed to be the antithesis of Anne Boleyn's. Where Anne had promoted religious reform and involved herself in politics, Jane was instructed to focus solely on her duties as wife and potential mother. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," perfectly encapsulated her role. She adopted a more conservative style of dress, favoring the English gable hood over the French hoods that Anne had popularized. But Jane was not merely passive. She showed considerable courage in attempting to reconcile Henry with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both declared bastards after their fathers' marriages were annulled. Jane's intercession helped restore Mary to the succession, though Elizabeth remained officially illegitimate. This diplomatic success demonstrated that even a submissive queen could wield significant influence when she chose her battles carefully. The most crucial test of Jane's queenship came with pregnancy. By January 1537, it was confirmed that the queen was expecting a child. Henry was ecstatic. This would be his third chance for a legitimate male heir. Jane's pregnancy was carefully managed, with the finest physicians and midwives attending her. The kingdom held its breath as the queen grew larger and the birth approached. On October 12, 1537, after a difficult labor lasting several days, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son at Hampton Court Palace. The prince was named Edward, after his great-grandfather Edward IV, and his birth was greeted with celebrations throughout England. Cannons fired from the Tower of London, bonfires blazed in every town square, and Te Deum services of Thanksgiving were held in every church. After 28 years of marriage and 3 wives, Henry VIII finally had his legitimate male heir. But triumph quickly turned to tragedy. Jane developed puerperal infection, a common and often fatal complication of childbirth in the 16th century. Despite the efforts of royal physicians, her condition deteriorated rapidly. High fever, severe pain, and delirium marked her final days. On October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, Jane Seymour died at Hampton Court. She was approximately 29 years old and had been queen for just over 18 months. Henry was genuinely devastated by Jane's death. Unlike his previous wives, Jane had fulfilled her primary purpose. She had given him a son, and died before disappointing him in any way. In his mind, she became the perfect queen, the one true wife among the 6. When Henry died in 1547, he was buried beside Jane at St. George's Chapels, Windsor, the only one of his wives to share his tomb. Jane's legacy was profound despite her brief reign. She was the mother of Edward VI, who would rule England for 6 years and advance the Protestant Reformation his father had begun. Her quiet influence helped restore stability to a court that had been racked by the turmoil of the King's Great Matter and Anne Boleyn's dramatic fall. More importantly, Jane represented a different model of queenship, one that prioritized harmony over confrontation, submission over assertion. This approach proved that a Tudor queen could be successful not by challenging royal authority, but by working within its constraints. Her example would influence how subsequent queens approached their roles. Jane Seymour proved that sometimes the greatest achievement is giving a king exactly what he wants when he wants it most. Her reward was death in childbirth, but also lasting honor as the mother of England's only legitimate Tudor prince and the wife Henry remembered most fondly. The next queen would face an entirely different challenge, surviving a marriage the king never wanted in the first place. On September 22, 1515, in the small German duchy of Cleves, a daughter was born who would become one of history's most fortunate royal brides. Anne, Anna in German, was the second daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Jülichburg. Her birth into this minor German principality seemed to destine her for a modest marriage within the Holy Roman Empire, but the religious upheavals of the 16th century would carry her to the throne of England and, ultimately, to a remarkably successful independent life. Anne's upbringing was typical of German Protestant nobility. The Duchy of Cleves had embraced Lutheran reform while maintaining independence from both Catholic and radical Protestant factions. Anne was educated in domestic skills, basic literacy in German, and the principles of Lutheran theology, but she received no classical education or training in languages. She learned to embroider beautifully, manage a household efficiently, and conduct herself with dignity, but she could neither read Latin nor speak French, accomplishments taken for granted in cosmopolitan European courts. The rise of Anne's political importance came not from her personal qualities, but from shifting European alliances. By 1538, Henry VIII found himself increasingly isolated. His break with Rome had alienated Catholic Europe, while his execution of Anne Boleyn had strained relations with Protestant powers. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, advocated for a Protestant alliance to counter the growing cooperation between Emperor Charles V and King Francis I of France. The Duke of Cleves, with his strategic location on the Rhine and his moderate Protestant stance, seemed an ideal ally. Marriage negotiations began in 1539, conducted entirely through ambassadors and letters. Henry had learned caution after 3 marriages and insisted on seeing a portrait of his prospective bride before committing himself. Hans Holbein the Younger, Henry's court painter and one of the greatest portraitists of the age, was dispatched to Cleves to paint Anne and her younger sister Amelia. Holbein's portrait of Anne, now in the Louvre, shows a woman of dignified bearing with strong features, dressed in the rich but conservative style of German nobility. Henry was satisfied with the portrait and the political advantages of the match. The marriage treaty was signed, and Anne began her journey to England in late 1539. She traveled in magnificent style with a retinue of over 250 attendants through Germany and the Low Countries to Calais, where English ships waited to carry her across the Channel. Anne arrived in England on December 27, 1539, and was greeted with elaborate ceremonies at every stop on her journey to Greenwich Palace. But before she could reach court, Henry made a decision that would prove disastrous. Eager to meet his bride and perhaps romantically inspired by tales of kings who secretly visited their betrothed, Henry decided to surprise Anne at Rochester Palace on New Year's Day 1540. The meeting was a catastrophe. Henry arrived in disguise, expecting Anne to recognize him through some mystical bond of true love as occurred in romantic literature. Instead, Anne, who had never seen Henry and was unfamiliar with English customs of courtly play acting, reacted with understandable confusion to advances from a stranger. Henry was forced to reveal his identity, but the damage was done. He had expected a romantic encounter with a beautiful princess and instead found himself facing a confused foreign woman who seemed utterly alien to his expectations. Henry's disappointment was immediate and visceral. Anne spoke no English, had no knowledge of English customs, and possessed none of the sophisticated court skills that had attracted him to his previous wives. More importantly, she simply did not resemble the woman he had imagined from Holbein's portrait. While the painting was accurate, it could not convey Anne's physical presence, her mannerisms, or her personality. Henry felt deceived and trapped. The wedding proceeded nonetheless on January 6, 1540, at Greenwich Palace, because the political alliance with Cleves remained important and because backing out would have been diplomatically disastrous. But Henry made no effort to hide his reluctance. He complained openly to his courtiers about his new wife and refused to consummate the marriage. Anne, bewildered by her husband's coldness but maintaining her dignity, tried to fulfill her role as queen while learning English and English customs. The marriage lasted exactly 6 months. By July 1540, the political situation had changed dramatically. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Cleves alliance, had fallen from favor and been executed. Henry no longer needed the German alliance and was already pursuing Katherine Howard, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. On July 12, 1540, the marriage was annulled on grounds of non-consummation and Anne's alleged pre-contract to Francis of Lorraine. Anne's response to this rejection proved her wisdom and political acumen. Rather than fighting the annulment like Katherine of Aragon or facing destruction like Anne Boleyn, Anne gracefully accepted the situation. She agreed to the annulment, acknowledged that the marriage had never been consummated, and accepted Henry's generous settlement. In return for her cooperation, Henry granted her the honorary title of the King's beloved sister, a substantial income of 4,000 per year, and several beautiful estates including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's former home. This settlement made Anne of Cleves one of the wealthiest women in England, and certainly the most fortunate of Henry's wives. She had escaped marriage to an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable king while securing financial independence and social status. She quickly adapted to English life, learning the language fluently and developing friendships at court. She maintained cordial relations with Henry and even with his subsequent wives, including Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. Anne's post-marriage life was remarkably successful. She lived comfortably in her various estates, entertaining guests, patronizing musicians and artists, and enjoying freedoms unavailable to married women of her time. She could travel, manage her own finances, and make her own decisions without answering to husband or father. When Mary I became queen in 1553, Anne's status actually improved, as Mary appreciated her stepmother's loyalty and Catholic sympathies. Anne of Cleves lived longer than any of Henry's other wives, dying peacefully at Chelsea Old Manor on July 16, 1557, at age 41. She was buried with royal honors at Westminster Abbey, where her tomb can still be visited today. She had survived Henry VIII by a decade and outlived 4 of his 6 wives. Anne's legacy is that of the smartest survivor in Tudor England. She understood that sometimes losing can be winning, that graceful acceptance of defeat can lead to victory, and that independence is more valuable than a crown. She proved that a woman could thrive in Tudor England by choosing her battles wisely and turning rejection into opportunity. Her example stands in stark contrast to the fate that would befall Henry's next wife, a young woman who lacked Anne's wisdom and would pay the ultimate price for her youth and inexperience. Around 1523 or 1524, Katherine Howard was born into one of England's most powerful noble families, but her early life was marked by neglect that would ultimately seal her fate. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, and Joyce Culpeper. Lord Edmund was a soldier who struggled financially despite his illustrious family connections, and when Catherine's mother died around 1528, the young girl was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Dowager Duchess's household at Chesworth House in Sussex and later at Norfolk House in London was a sprawling establishment housing dozens of young noblewomen and gentlewomen. It should have provided Catherine with education and protection, but instead it operated with shocking laxity. The Dowager Duchess, elderly and preoccupied with other matters, exercised little supervision over her charges. Young women came and went freely, and relationships flourished without oversight. Catherine received minimal formal education. She could barely read and write and knew no languages other than English. Unlike her predecessors, who were educated in theology, classical literature, or court culture, Catherine learned only basic domestic skills and the art of pleasing men. Her education came primarily from the older girls in the household who taught her about romance, fashion, and sexual relationships. It was in this unsupervised environment that Catherine, probably around age 13, began her first romantic relationship with Henry Manox, her music teacher. Manox was a young gentleman hired to teach the girls to play musical instruments, and he quickly became infatuated with the pretty, vivacious Catherine. Their relationship was sexual, as later testimony would reveal, and it was conducted with the knowledge of other girls in the household. When the relationship with Manox ended, Catherine became involved with Francis Dereham, a gentleman pensioner in the Dowager Duchess's service. This relationship was more serious. They exchanged gifts, called each other husband and wife, and may have considered themselves married under the informal customs of the time. Dereham was several years older than Catherine and treated the relationship as a betrothal, but Catherine was still a teenager and her feelings were changeable. In 1539, when Catherine was about 15, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, arranged for her to join the household of Anne of Cleves as a lady-in-waiting. This was intended to advance the Howard family's fortunes at court, and it succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Catherine's youth, beauty, and vivacious personality immediately caught the attention of the aging Henry VIII, now 49 and increasingly corpulent and irascible. Henry's attraction to Catherine was immediate and powerful. After the disappointment of Anne of Cleves, he was delighted to find himself captivated by a young Englishwoman who seemed to represent everything he found appealing: youth, beauty, fertility, and most importantly, complete submissiveness to his will. Catherine, now about 16, was flattered by the king's attention and excited by the prospect of becoming queen. Their courtship was brief but intense. Henry showered Catherine with gifts, jewelry, fine clothes, and lands. The Howard family encouraged the relationship, seeing it as their path back to power after their earlier association with Anne Boleyn had nearly destroyed them. On July 28, 1540, just 18 days after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. Catherine's reign as queen began with promise and celebration. Henry was rejuvenated by his young bride, calling her his rose without a thorn, and lavishing attention and gifts upon her. She was crowned informally. No official coronation was ever held, but she was acknowledged as queen and took her place at the center of court life. For a few months, it seemed that Catherine had achieved the impossible dream of a minor noble family's daughter. But Catherine's past would not remain buried. In the autumn of 1541, rumors began circulating about her previous relationships. The catalyst was John Lascelles, a reformist who had a grudge against the conservative Howard family. Lascelles approached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer with testimony from his sister Mary, who had served in the Dowager Duchess's household and witnessed Catherine's relationships with both Manox and Dereham. Cranmer was faced with a terrible dilemma. He was duty-bound to inform the king, but he knew that Henry's reaction would be explosive. On November 2, 1541, during All Saints' Day service at Hampton Court, Cranmer slipped Henry a letter detailing the allegations. Henry's reaction was everything Cranmer had feared. The king flew into a rage, alternately threatening to torture Catherine to death and weeping over his betrayal. But the investigation uncovered something even more damaging than Catherine's past relationships, evidence of her continued infidelity as queen. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber and Catherine's distant cousin, had been conducting a secret relationship with the queen. They had exchanged letters and met secretly during the royal progress to the north in the summer of 1541. Catherine's letter to Culpeper, discovered during the investigation, was passionate and compromising. "It makes my heart to die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company." The evidence was overwhelming. Catherine had concealed her sexual past when she married the king, and she had committed adultery after becoming queen. Under the laws of the time, both offenses constituted treason. On November 12, 1541, Catherine was stripped of her royal title and confined to Sion Abbey. Her alleged lovers and accomplices were arrested, tried, and executed. Culpeper and Derham were both beheaded in December 1541. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against Catherine in January 1542, making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king without revealing her past. Catherine was not allowed to defend herself or appear before Parliament. On February 11, 1542, she was brought from Sion Abbey to the Tower of London, the same prison where Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. Catherine's execution was set for February 13, 1542. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had maintained her composure and dignity to the end, Catherine was completely overwhelmed by terror. She was approximately 18 years old, and her youth and inexperience showed in her final hours. She spent her last night practicing laying her head on the block, determined to die with some semblance of dignity. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Katherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. Her final speech was brief and conventional, acknowledging her offenses and asking for prayers for the king and the realm. She was beheaded with a single stroke of the axe and buried beside Anne Boleyn in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. Katherine Howard's legacy is that of youth destroyed by the dangerous world of Tudor politics. She was a teenager thrust into a situation far beyond her maturity or understanding, surrounded by ambitious adults who used her for their own purposes without regard for her welfare. Her story illustrates the particular vulnerability of women in Tudor England, where sexual misconduct could mean death, and where the king's favor, however passionate, provided no ultimate security. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine left no children, no religious legacy, and no political impact. She was simply a casualty of Henry VIII's increasingly paranoid and brutal rule. Her brief life serves as a warning about the price of ambition and the dangers that awaited any woman who caught the attention of England's most dangerous king. But Henry would marry once more, and his final wife would prove that it was possible to survive marriage to Henry VIII if one possessed enough intelligence, caution, and sheer determination. On an August day in 1512, Catherine Parr was born at Kendal Castle in Westmoreland to Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, entering a world that would demand every ounce of her intelligence, courage, and diplomatic skill. The Parr family were established courtiers with a tradition of royal service. Her father served as a gentleman of the chamber to Henry VIII, and her mother was a lady-in-waiting to Katherine of Aragon. From birth, Catherine was destined for court life, but unlike Henry's previous wives, she would come to the throne as a mature woman with experience, wisdom, and a clear understanding of the dangers she faced. Catherine's education was exceptional by the standards of her time. The Parr family embraced the humanist ideals of the Renaissance, believing strongly in education for both sons and daughters. Catherine learned Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, studied theology and philosophy, and developed a lifelong love of learning that would distinguish her throughout her life. When her father died in 1517, her mother ensured that Catherine's education continued under the finest tutors available. At age 17, around 1529, Catherine was married to Edward Burrough, son of Thomas Burrough, 1st Baron Burrough. This was a typical noble marriage of the time, a political and economic alliance between families rather than a love match. Edward was significantly older than Catherine and in poor health. The marriage was brief. Edward died in 1533, leaving Catherine a widow at 21 with no children and modest financial means. Catherine's second marriage in 1534 was to John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, a powerful northern lord who was significantly older than she was. This marriage brought Catherine wealth, status, and valuable experience in managing large estates and navigating political complexities. Lord Latimer was a traditional Catholic who became involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, the 1536 rebellion against Henry VIII's religious reforms. Catherine found herself in the dangerous position of being married to a rebel, but she managed to help secure her husband's pardon and the family's survival. During her marriage to Lord Latimer, Catherine was responsible for raising his 2 children from his previous marriage, John and Margaret Neville. She proved to be an excellent stepmother, providing them with education and guidance while managing the family's extensive properties in Yorkshire. These years taught her valuable lessons in diplomacy, household management, and the art of surviving in dangerous political times. Lord Latimer died in 1543, leaving Catherine a wealthy widow at 31. She was now experienced in the ways of the world, financially independent, and free to make her own choices. She had already attracted the attention of Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour and uncle to Prince Edward. Seymour was charming, ambitious, and genuinely attracted to Catherine, and she reciprocated his feelings. For the first time in her life, Catherine was in love, but Catherine's feelings for Thomas Seymour would have to wait. Henry VIII had also noticed the intelligent, mature, and attractive widow. In 1543, Henry was 52 years old, increasingly ill with what was probably diabetes and a chronic leg ulcer, and in need of a wife who could serve as companion, nurse, and regent. Catherine Parr possessed exactly the qualities he required: intelligence without threatening independence, religious conviction without dangerous radicalism, and the maturity to manage both his physical needs and the complex politics of his court. Catherine faced an impossible choice. Refusing the king's marriage proposal meant death or exile, but accepting it meant abandoning her love for Thomas Seymour and entering a marriage with a man who had already executed 2 wives. She chose survival and duty over love, though it cost her greatly. On July 12, 1543, Catherine Parr became Henry VIII's 6th and final wife in a private ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. Catherine's queenship was marked by remarkable success in navigation of the most dangerous court in Europe. She understood that her survival depended on being useful to Henry without challenging his authority. She served as his nurse during his increasingly frequent illnesses, managing his care with patience and skill. She acted as stepmother to his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, helping to reconcile the family and ensuring that all 3 were restored to the succession. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine served as regent when Henry campaigned in France in 1544. This was an extraordinary demonstration of trust from a king who had grown increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. Catherine governed England competently for several months, handling correspondence, managing finances, and maintaining order. Her success as regent proved that she possessed not just intelligence, but genuine political ability. Catherine was also a scholar and author, becoming the first Queen of England to publish books under her own name. Her Prayers or Meditations, 1545, was a compilation of devotional works that became hugely popular. Her Lamentation of a Sinner, 1547, was a more personal work exploring Protestant theology and her own spiritual journey. These publications established Catherine as a serious intellectual and religious reformer, though she was always careful to present her views as humble submissions to royal authority. Catherine's religious convictions were genuinely Protestant, and she used her influence to protect reformers and advance religious education. She employed leading Protestant scholars as tutors for Prince Edward and Princess Elizabeth, ensuring that the next generation of royals would be thoroughly educated in Reformed theology. Her influence on Elizabeth's education would prove particularly significant for England's future. But Catherine's success in managing Henry did not mean she was safe. In 1546, conservative bishops led by Stephen Gardiner attempted to destroy her by claiming she was promoting heretical views. They obtained a warrant for her arrest and planned to charge her with treason. Catherine learned of the plot and responded with brilliant political theater. She approached Henry and humbly submitted to his superior theological knowledge, claiming that any religious discussions she had initiated were merely attempts to distract him from the pain of his leg ulcer and to learn from his greater wisdom. Henry was mollified by her submission, and when the bishops came to arrest Catherine the next day, he turned on them furiously, declaring his wife innocent and ordering them away. Catherine had saved herself through a perfect understanding of Henry's psychology and a willingness to subordinate her pride to her survival. Catherine's greatest test came with Henry's death on January 28, 1547. She had outlived the most dangerous king in English history, but her survival was not yet assured. As Dowager Queen, she was wealthy and prominent, but also vulnerable. Within months of Henry's death, she finally married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved for years. Their marriage was happy but brief. In 1548, at age 35, Catherine became pregnant for the first time. After 3 marriages and 15 years of adult life, she was finally expecting a child. The pregnancy proceeded normally, and on August 30th, 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. But like Jane Seymour before her, Catherine developed puerperal fever after childbirth. Despite having survived Henry VIII, court intrigue, and the dangerous politics of the Reformation, Catherine Parr died on September 5, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth. She was 36 years old and had been free to live and love as she chose for barely 18 months. Catherine Parr's legacy extends far beyond her survival of Henry VIII. She was a pioneer of female authorship, a patron of learning, and a crucial influence on the education of Elizabeth I. Her regency proved that women could govern effectively, and her religious writings contributed to the development of English Protestantism. Most importantly, Catherine represented a new model of queenship, one based on intelligence, competence, and careful political management rather than beauty, fertility, or submission. She proved that it was possible to maintain one's principles and beliefs while surviving in the Tudor court, and she showed that a woman could be both learned and influential without threatening male authority. Catherine Parr was the last queen of the Tudor Renaissance, and she helped shape the intellectual and religious environment that would produce Elizabeth I's golden age. Her life demonstrated that with sufficient intelligence, caution, and courage, even the most dangerous situations could be survived and turned to advantage. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind more than a kingdom transformed by religious revolution and political upheaval. He left a legacy of 6 women whose lives had become inextricably woven into the fabric of English history, and whose children would rule England for the next 60 years. From Katherine of Aragon came Mary I, who would rule for 5 years and attempt to restore Catholic England. Her reign, though brief and ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the determination and religious conviction she inherited from her Spanish mother. Catherine's influence lived on in Mary's unwavering faith and her refusal to compromise her beliefs, even when those beliefs proved politically disastrous. From Anne Boleyn came Elizabeth I, who would reign for 45 years and oversee England's transformation into a major European power. Elizabeth inherited her mother's intelligence, political acumen, and ability to navigate dangerous situations. Anne's promotion of religious reform and education bore fruit in Elizabeth's court, which became a center of learning, literature, and religious tolerance. The daughter succeeded where the mother had failed, proving that a woman could rule England effectively while maintaining her independence and authority. From Jane Seymour came Edward VI, who ruled for just 6 years but advanced the Protestant Reformation begun by his father. Though Edward died young, his reign ensured that England would remain Protestant, fulfilling Jane's sacrifice and completing the religious revolution that had cost so many lives. Edward's education under Catherine Parr's chosen tutors shaped his commitment to Reformed theology and his vision of godly kingship. The last 3 wives, Anne of Cleves, Katherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, bore no children who survived to rule, but their contributions to English history were no less significant. Anne of Cleves proved that intelligence and pragmatism could triumph over royal displeasure, creating a model of successful survival that would inspire other women facing impossible situations. Catherine Howard's tragedy served as a permanent reminder of the dangers that awaited women who underestimated the deadly seriousness of Tudor politics. Catherine Parr's intellectual and religious leadership helped shape the educational and spiritual environment that would produce the Elizabethan Golden Age. Together, these 6 women redefined what it meant to be queen in England. They proved that women could be regents, scholars, religious reformers, and political leaders. They showed that queenship could be about more than producing heirs, that women could influence religion, education, and governance in lasting ways. Their stories remind us that behind every great historical transformation are human beings who loved, hoped, feared, and endured. The English Reformation was not just about theology and politics. It was about people whose personal choices and individual courage shaped the destiny of a nation. The echo of 6 Crowns continues to resonate through British history, reminding us that the most profound changes often begin with the determination of individuals to live according to their convictions, whatever the cost. In their triumphs and tragedies, their courage and their mistakes, Henry VIII's 6 wives became more than queens. They became symbols of the eternal human struggle for dignity, meaning, and survival in a world where power and powerlessness, love and ambition, faith and pragmatism intersect in ways both beautiful and terrible. Their legacy lives on not just in the monarchs who followed them, but in the continuing story of women who refuse to be silently defined by others' expectations, who insist on writing their own chapters in the great book of history.